Okay, today's stream is going to be about custom procedural spawners. So I'm going to start by showing a demo what I'm talking about. So here's a cave system. Doesn't have a lot of stuff in it. It should be completely closed up or whatever. And if I were to just start playing from here, you can see there are some meshes, some foliage, some coral and shells and things like that getting spawned here. Normally you can get this with the Unreal Engine spawner, procedural spawner, but I've also, the version that I'm using here is, what is it, 4.15. So I'm too far into the game to go to a newer version, and the Unreal procedural spawners are crashing if I use them in here. So I had to come up with another plan, and this is what I came up with. I'm just gonna demo that and just show that. Let's open up another level here. This is just another test level. I'm going to start with the basics of how I started deriving this solution. So I started by creating a blueprint called a procedural static. I'm going to go into detail into all of these. I'm just quickly going to show a demo of how it works on its own. So what it tries to do when you invoke it, it uses an algorithm along with a sphere of a specific size, and then it tries to find random spots using a random stream that gets seeded, so you can predict where it will be next time. And you can see all these red points here are collisions, and the green is after the collision. So it's just casting a swept sphere from the center of the actor where I placed it out, and then just recording those hits. And if I play with some of these options here, you can see this is where to place those meshes, trying to wrap to the surface optionally with some options. And you can also specify quite a few values here. And the problem with this guy, just running him on his own, this guy's running stuff in the construction script, which is all going to get lost when you save and load the level again. So that you need some way to remember this stuff, which is quite important. And because I'm using a random seed, I can predict which way it's going to spawn next time. So what I came up with is this thing called a begin procedural. If you place this in a level, it's going to kick off the process of spawning these guys and telling them to do whatever they need to do. I'm just going to show another demo of what this guy did here. So building on that idea, I came up with another blueprint that you saw, that sphere that it created there, this white sphere. This is a debug sphere trying to size up how big an area it's got to spawn static meshes. And now these are all instant static meshes, so they render a pretty good frame rate, or that's what they're supposed to be. And then there are some rules that we're going to go through now that it uses to populate this little area here. So I'm going to start at the beginning. But before I do, let's just go to the test level again and just see this in action one more time. I'm going to go to another area here. So you see all around this level, I've got these things called generate spawners. They're dotted all around the level. And if I kick them off, well, if I play from here, you'll see suddenly the level is populated with these meshes. The foliage and all that. And they've all got level of detail. They're fully animated so you can see them moving along with the wind. There's a wind directional source on here. So everything is based around these begin procedurals. This is a blueprint that kicks off the entire process. The first thing it does is it calls this find and size procedurals. It's just a blueprint, it has nothing in it, it does not have any tick or anything like that. It's just a pure blueprint with some visual code. So in the begin plate, it calls this find and size procedurals function. And this function is then going through all of the actors of a specific class, calling this looking for generate spawners class, and then calling this size sphere on it. Now this generate spawners class, I'm going to go through these classes in a lot more detail, is also just the blueprint, has nothing on it. It's got a few variables on it, nothing special. But they're dotted all around the level where you would want stuff to spawn. I'm spawning very specific stuff here. So it calls this, initially it calls this size sphere on each of these guys. And what this does, so this is on the generate spawners being called from the begin procedurals. There's only going to be one of these begin procedurals in the level. There's going to be many of these generate spawners in the level, anywhere, everywhere where you want specific meshes. So what the size sphere does, and what it tries to do, is try to determine the sphere size or the spawn size of the area that it can spawn in. So it tries to find as many collisions as it can in various directions. So it uses the forward, up, and then a combination of both to create this, all these red lines that you see going here. And then it uses and gathers all the hit points that it found into an array. And it has some, you know, debug values and all that to debug, to show what it found, etc. But then it uses the sphere trace to basically determine if it hit something. I'm only tracing against world static and world dynamic. Now these are all physics collisions. And then if it found a blocking hit, it records that hit point. This hit point will be in world space. And then it adds it to an array. It does this for all of those 360 degree, well, not really 360. It adds, you can see here, it adds 45 degrees in a loop 8 times, starting from compass heading north for the forward vector, the up vector, and then a combination of both, giving you all those however many 22 directions or however many it is, finding all the hits it can find. It does this for a ray distance of I think it's 10,000. If you look at check hit, it should go out for 10,000. It's really far, so it just tries and finds the hit as far as it can. Yeah, it's using 10,000. So how I did it is just by rotating either the right or the up vector, using yaw or pitch by 45 iterations of 45 degrees at a time, and then scaling that up and then using that value from the actor location, which will be the center of the sphere, outwards, and then it will just do a trace. It's using a swept sphere physics collision here of a radius of 5, and it's using complex tracing. And then all I'm interested in is, did it hit? Is it a blocking hit? Of course. And then I'm recording those unique values there. It may record values that it has already recorded before, so I don't want to skew the average there, but I'm trying to determine the area that these things can spawn in. So once this has been done, in the generate spawners, once it's determined all those hit points, it gathers them up and calls this find average function. And what it does is just very simple, goes through all the hit points, finds the vector length relative to the actor location of itself, so the center of the sphere, basically finds all the lengths of these hit points and averages them together. So the duration of the loop uses the sphere radius as the variable. This is just a local variable, local float, and at the end of the loop it will go through and just divide that by the length of hit points. So it's just calculating the average of all the hit points, vector lengths, and setting that as its sphere radius of this collision sphere here set on this generate spawner. So it's trying to set the correct size, or the average size of what it has to spawn in. What area does it have to spawn in? So the begin procedurals then calls the size sphere function for all of the generate spawners it can find in the level. Once it's done that, it's going to go through another iteration calling on the generate spawners again this function called generate and spawn. And what this function is responsible of doing is to generate a few blueprints using the sphere radius that it got multiplied by 2, which was calculated just in the previous loop. And then there's some debug values here if need be, and then just simply calling this spawn all actors on itself. And what this does is this will actually then create a whole bunch of these procedural statics. So, but before I continue, I just wanted to quickly just explain what these procedural statics are. So we have procedural, coral, shell, foliage, long, sponge, and foliage short. These are all child classes of a particular class. So if we look at the spawn actor single class function, it gets past the function to spawn, and once it spawns that, it actually casts it to the parent class, which is this procedural static. The procedural static class has quite a few values in it, and it's responsible for managing a dynamic component array of instant static mesh components, and then you provide it with a set of mesh templates. So let me just close that for a second and just go to this procedural coral that I added here in the beginning, which is one of the child classes. So it has a template, 2 template meshes, these two, coral 3 and coral 4. So it's going to spawn these static meshes here using whatever algorithm I'm going to explain now. And these variables or values that I've set here, I've given it basically a min and max value for how many to spawn, some slope values, a scale min and max, whether or not it should align to the surface, and what is the maximum value it can pitch. If I just run this guy, you can see all the red is where it would have decided to spawn something at. And then every now and then you see this guy's bouncing off here and then decided to spawn there. If I hit it again, it's going to do exactly the same as it did before, because it's using a set seed. So I'm using set seeds so I can accurately determine how these things will accurately predict the next time where these things will spawn. I don't want them to spawn randomly every single time. I do want them to spawn in exactly the same way they've been doing all along. So if I switch this no spawn off, that's it. That is where it would spawn these meshes. So what the generate spawners is doing is just managing a dynamic list of these objects here, or components here, and then provides functionality to call, you know, spawning them and things like that. So continuing on from where I was with the generate spawners, it's going to create each one of these guys. So procedural, coral, shell, foliage, sponge, and another type of foliage. Now once again, these are child classes of the procedural static, and what the spawn actor single does is spawns that particular blueprint at the location it's found at, so at the exact same location as the generate spawners was found, and then setting the sphere radius so that it, because it determined that earlier, how big should the sphere radius be. And then it does this for all these guys here. So it's going to be creating 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 blueprints in exactly the same place with the same sphere size. And then once that's done, we're back at the begin procedurals, because that's what it was supposed to do. It was supposed to figure out how big is the area each one of these guys can spawn in, and to create those blueprints and size their spawn spheres accordingly. And then the next step would be to call these functions here, begin spawning. And this function is called in a particular order. So first I want the coral guys to spawn, then the sponges, then the shells, and then the short and long foliage. And what this involves, we're going to go through now, but basically it will detect and collide with any previous meshes that it found. So it's going to sort of layering the spawners on top of each other. So once it's done creating all of those blueprints, it goes through and then it calls this begin spawning function, passing in just a string coral. And what this does is it goes through their level, finding all these procedural static actors that it just created. Now there's going to be 3 or 4 subclasses of these for each one, right? Procedural static has all these subclasses here. Procedural coral is a subclass of procedural static. So it's going to find all these guys that it just created, loop through them, check, make sure they're valid, and then check if their name matches the name that I passed in. The first name would be coral, and if that's true, it's going to invoke some functions here. The first thing is it's going to set the random seed to a specific value, and then increment that seed so that I can control the seed somewhat for each level if I need to. These will be used more for internal levels. And then it calls this respawn all on each of these procedural static child classes. And what this does, firstly, is clears all of its dynamic instances. So it has these components here. One of them is an array of instant static mesh components, which will initially be empty. It has the mesh templates, which will be set differently for each instance or child blueprint. So for the foliage, there will be different mesh templates here. They have 11 meshes here that I'd like to spawn. For the sponge, it'll be different. For the coral and for the shells. So for the sponge, they're different. So what it does is first goes through anything that's there, check if it's valid, clears the instances. So it's making sure that anything that was there has been removed, which is very important. And then it empties the array. Once that loop is done, it comes through and goes through your templates that you've defined here, which will be different for every child instance. Check if they're valid, and then basically create this add instance static mesh component. Call this function here, which will create an instance static mesh component. It then adds this to this dynamic array of meshes here, right? It's an array of meshes. Yeah, I guess any array is dynamic. So it adds it there, or adds a reference to it there, and then sets the call distances and sets the static mesh. Right, so the target here of set static mesh is the static mesh component that it just created, and the mesh itself comes from the mesh template. So it's just building up an array of instance static mesh components from the mesh templates. That's what it's doing. Setting the max draw distance to a predetermined value. If the collision has been set on here, then any instances spawned will have collision enabled, otherwise they will not. So that's what the clear all instances does. We're back in the respawn all. So the first thing this does is basically, the first thing that respawn all did was just make sure that everything's cleaned up and that all instance static mesh components are rebuilt from their mesh templates. That's really all it did, in case you call it more than once. The next step is to go into a main loop to start actually spawning these static meshes. Keeping in mind we're in the begin play now, getting called from the begin procedurals. So the first thing it does is decides how many it's going to spawn using the values supplied here. You give it a spawn min and max. These will be set where every child instance will have different values for min and max. So it chooses a value using that same stream. It's got a random stream here. I use the random stream because then I can set the seed and thereby ensure every time I call this function in the level, it's going to be the same, give me the same results, even though it's random every single time I call it, which is very important. Important for mesh placing and things like that, like static mesh placing and not this procedural stuff. So now I know how many I want to spawn. It goes into a while loop. And then I have a variable here called current spawn count. So while this is 0, while this is less than the max I want to spawn, I basically go to a loop. And inside the loop I call this find spawn location, passing it a start and end location. The start location is always the actor location where it is now. So for all of these guys, for coral, sponge, all of these guys dotted all around the map, they're going to be using wherever they've been placed as the starting point, and then a random unit vector scaled by the sphere radius times 2. Very important. Times 2, so it actually stays within the sphere. So it's going to choose a random spawn location within the radius, and then call this find spawn location. What this find spawn location is responsible for is basically what you see here. That's what we're doing now here. That's calling the find spawn location, all these red guys coming out here. So this is where the algorithm comes in, or the algorithm that I chose, or that I'm using. It's got some debug tracing optionally set, and then it just does a sphere trace. So it's using a swept sphere, radius 5, trace complex, looking for any static or dynamic collisions from a start and end point. If it did find any hits, and if there are blocking hits, and the actor that it hit is valid, very important, then what I do is record that information, the hit, the normal, and the location, and then I go into a secondary check based on some random value. So also using the stream, so I can predict it again every time. If that random value is less than or greater than or equal to less than 0.5, this value is actually not used. Less than 0.5, so it's a 50-50 chance. No, 40-60 I guess, because it's excluding 0.5, so it could be from 0.49 999 infinity to 0. So if it's less than 0.5, it's going to go into this secondary call. What it's doing here, it's just calling itself. So this blueprint is calling itself here, find spawn location again, using a random location within the sphere. So it's doing a bounce, and you can actually see that bounce here. You can see there it chose to hit this object here and then bounce off, and then finally collide here. So the green, that little green line means it found something to hit. Everything where it's just red means it didn't find anything, and anything where it's green means it found a hit. So then it can go into a secondary call to call itself. And then once it comes back from there, it just records these values, out location, out normal, and out hit into local variables, and then continued on from where it would go if it did not decide to do the bounce. And then it does some optional debugging here, and then it just simply returns. So whether or not it hit something is completely determined by the sphere trace. So if this hit something, we're going to set these values, this value to true, and if it did not, it will be false, because it's a local variable, right? So every time we come in here, it will default to false. And then we just simply return from this function. And when that function returns, we check the value. Did we hit something? And if we did, and we do have instance static mesh components in our array, we call this spawn static mesh function, passing in the impact normal and the location of the hit. And this function is actually where all of the, where the heart of the spawning lies. So the algorithm to determine where to spawn has now already been done, and this is now just using the values that we've given here, like slope min-max, scale, and all that stuff, aligned to surface pitch max, to determine how to place it. We've already determined, cool, we want to place something here, and now we're just going to place it there. So the first thing I do, this is the way I do it, I use a temporary object. So I'm spawning, not really spawning, I'm adding a static mesh component to this blueprint, a temporary cube. It's a cube. And then I'm just setting a variable here, temp cube. It's a local variable, so it will always be null when the method starts. And this is a cube. It's literally adding a cube to this blueprint. And then the next step is I choose one of these instance static mesh components randomly. So this is another place where you can tweak and decide, oh, I'd like to not choose them randomly, or I'd like to do it in a sequence, or whatever the case may be. So this is just going to choose a random instance static mesh. So it's going to choose either one of these corals here. If it was the coral, it's going to choose either one of these foliage meshes here, of these 11. It'll choose one of these. It'll choose either one of these 3 sponges. To spawn. And then it sets another local variable called the inst mesh. I reset the relative transform of the cube, which I don't really need to do here. And then I try and get the slope angle of what I'm, where the normal was recorded using the forward vector of the actor. and well, using this is the, I think, the dot product of the forward vector, well, the dot product of the impact normal with the active forward vector. So the parent. So the active forward vector of this loop right here would be the location of the static spawner itself, and then use that forward vector, get the dot product. So yeah, get the dot product of the impact normal with the forward vector. I need to move these a little bit. And then I do the inverse cos, cosine, but with the negative of that dot product to determine the slope angle. How correct this is, debatable. I think it works. Did some debugging and it seems to work. And then I just make sure that it's within the slope minimum and maximum. If it is, I continue on here. If it's not, I actually just make sure that I clean up this cube. And then the execution stops here. So the loop that called this originally is in a while, so it's expecting stuff to spawn using this variable here, current spawn count. So while this current spawn count is less than the max spawn, it's going to just continue doing this. It's going to try and look for a spawn location, and if it finds one, it's going to call spawn static mesh. So if spawn static mesh decided the slope is not good enough, it will just try and find another hit point. So if your sphere is too small and you're not making contact with anything, or your slope angle is wrong, it will go into an endless loop. So if the slope angle was fine, it would continue on here and then try and, well, it would then set the location. Doing some, what are we doing here? Just adjusting the Z min and max a little bit. So, well, adjusting the up using a Z min and max value, so it can push in or out. I think generally you want to make the Z max negative value to push it in a little bit more. I think I did that. Oh, I made the min -5. Okay, so I made the minimum -5 and the maximum 0, so it can push in a little bit more. And then it's just setting the location. Now, all these operations, setting location, this operation is taking place on this temporary cube that I created here. The next step after setting the location is doing the scale. So it's just determining a scale between the minimum and maximum. Using the random stream again, it's always using the random stream. It should be using the random stream everywhere, so it can be predictable for every level. And then setting the cube's relative scale. Then the next step is doing a random pitch and yaw. Even though I have these values set here, I don't actually use random, I think, yaw. I don't really care. Oh, I did remove it. Okay, cool. So I am using pitch maximum. So I'm just adjusting the yaw by a random value always, instead of checking a boolean. So I could easily just introduce a new variable here and just check if I did set it, give it a random yaw. I prefer a random yaw always versus using the world forward, you know, with no yaw. That makes no sense. Always one random yaw, I think. Then it's adjusting the pitch a little bit using the pitch max value supplied and 0 as the minimum. Once again using the random stream, and then it's just setting that, adding that relative rotation to the cube. So the first stuff it did was setting the location and adding some relative rotation. Then the next step is, if align to surface is set, we're going to branch off here and do some tricky stuff. This is the same stuff I did to make the crab follow the surface. It's basically just determining the character rotation using the surface normal. So it's using the getting the right vector of the cube that as it is currently, calling this making rotation from YZ, using the Z from the impact normal. So you'll see these lines, these two lines all the way here, they go from impact normal, this guy here, they're going down here. And then once I've made that vector, I break it up into a rotator, and I'm just interested in the pitch, and I use the pitch to create a new rotator. And for the roll and yaw, I use the forward vector of the cube, make a rotation from xz using the z from the impact normal, breaking the rotator and using the roll and yaw. So I use the pitch from the right vector from the impact normal in the cube, and then the forward vector from the cube, making rotation from the impact normal for the roll and the yaw. So then that rotator then becomes the world rotation for this cube. Now the cube is going to be aligned to the surface. The next thing I do is actually create the instance, create the static mesh. I'm calling this add instance world space. So now it's going to create whatever static mesh I decided to use. Randomly using this local variable here, the inst mesh, which was set here in the beginning, right here, from a random decision in the array. And then I'm just using the transform from the cube. Then once that's done, I say, okay, cool, I spawned another guy, and then destroy the cube, the temporary cube, then it's gone. So then eventually I will fall out of this loop here, and it would have spawned enough to satisfy the conditions here. It will fall out of the loop, and then check. I'm using this no spawn here and just clearing all instances if it's set for the visuals. But then it's essentially done. It's done its job. It spawned all the static meshes it could. These static meshes also have their max door distance and things, and their calling distance and things like that set. And that gets kicked off from finding size procedurals, generate and spawn. That should happen in here somewhere, I think. Spawn actors. So once it's decided to spawn one of those procedural static child blueprints and adding them to the array of those meshes, it will set the should set it somewhere. Oh, it's here. Sorry, wrong place. Generate the spawn. It's the draw distance somewhere. Check my notes. Ah, they're useless. Okay. Because it's quite important to set the draw distance, otherwise it's just gonna always render those always going to render those instant static meshes, which you don't want. Just need to find a function where I do that. That's where I create the instant static mesh itself. I thought it was here. must be clean instances. Oh, okay. So when I create the dynamic mesh array, or the mesh array of instance static components from the mesh templates, that would make sense. Then I set the draw distances and call distances here. That's just what I wanted to find. It's a bit tricky. I didn't have my comments and stuff everywhere, but that's good. It's always good to do this in a live demo. So just to show you what I was talking about and rambling on here, if I move away from this area, there, that white you can see the size that it determined was optimal for this area to spawn in. And as I start moving away and it starts hitting further, then I think it's 10,000, that they're going to start chopping out or culling out. And there we go. So you can set those values if you wanted to by exposing a parameter or whatever, but currently it's hard coded to 10,000, which I think is pretty far, especially considering there's going to be a whole bunch of other stuff in between. So what makes this very useful is, first of all, I don't need to worry about upgrading to the latest engine because the procedural spawners are crashing when I use them here, so I had to do this. Second of all, I didn't have to spend any money to buy something from the marketplace. I could use this, I can tweak the algorithms if I didn't like the way that they spawn, or they're too close together or whatever. I could come in here and I could tweak these algorithms that decides where stuff will spawn and get them working differently, better, or whatever I want. Gives me a bit more freedom. Sometimes you get a little bit of clumping when the areas are really tight together or close together or closed, you know, like this here, this walkway or swimway or flyway, whatever you want to call it. So I could fix this by playing with the seeds or lowering the amount of geometry that's getting spawned here dynamically. So I have a lot of control here. I don't need to worry about, you know, is this stuff going to work with a new level or things like that. So just another quick test I could try. I haven't done this, probably not going to work. Just going to drop some stuff in here. I have a blueprint to handle the sky sphere. And then I'm just going to add some geometry here. Let's see. Just going to add this. See what this looks like. Gonna duplicate that. Again. So now I've just started this level from scratch. Chicken scratch. Okay, it's got stuff in it. It's got some holes. I don't really care. See what happens. It breaks, it breaks. It's good to test. I'm not even going to save. Hopefully it doesn't crash. I should save it, really. And then what I'm going to do, just with this, is just quickly test it from here. So I get this nice blocky looking piece of stuff. I'm going to drop in one of, or two of those generic spawners that I've been rambling on about for the past hour, if I can find them. So generate spawner. I'm going to drop one here. I'm going to drop another one here. So I'm just duplicating this guy and putting it there. I could maybe drop a third one if I wanted. I just want to see what this does. I'm going to move it a bit more this way. So I've got two of them in here now. If I hit play, nothing's going to happen, which is 100% correct. But if I drop in one of these begin procedural spawners, once again, I can put this thing anywhere I want. It doesn't have to be here. I can put it all the way up there. It doesn't matter where it is. If I hit play now, it worked. And if I put some debugging on these guys, see what the hell did you guys try and do? There we go. That's what it tried to do. Sized itself up, spawned a whole bunch of static spawners there, sized them up, and then invoked them in the correct sequence from beginning to end, layering the spawners on top of each other, and this is the end result. Granted, I could play around with values, spawning more, spawning less, depending on the size of the area or the size of the sphere, things like that. I could change the algorithm. I have a lot of freedom here. Just showed you my way of doing this. Cool, thank you.